You think presidents rule the world, or billionaires like Elon Musk? But what about the ones whose names you've never even heard, but whose decisions can shake stock markets, crash currencies, and even start wars? I'm talking about the US Federal Reserve. It's been called both a paper emperor and the invisible conductor of the global economy. Let's break down why the Fed is the most powerful institution on Earth and what the future holds for the US dollar. Today, we'll uncover the story of the Fed's creation, complete with secret meetings of bankers, break down how it works, from managing interest rates to the days when supporting the economy meant printing trillions out of thin air. We'll trace the dollar's path to becoming the world's reserve currency and find out what holds up America's massive debt pyramid. And we'll also reveal who pays for America's economic miracles and what new threats lie in wait for the dollar. Picture this. It's the fall of 1907. A stock market crash, panic in the eyes of depositors, banks on the brink of collapse. The country realized its financial system needed a major overhaul. Senator Nelson Aldrich, head of the National Monetary Commission, a special congressional body tasked with reforming the banking system after the crisis, took matters into his own hands. In 1910, he organized a secret meeting of influential U.S. bankers and politicians on Jekyll Island to hash out a plan for reforming the nation's entire financial system. At a secluded resort on Jekyll Island, Aldrich gathered the country's leading financiers. Among them were Paul Warburg, the future architect of the Fed, Henry Davison, the right-hand man of banker J.P. Morgan, and Frank Vanderlip, president of one of the largest banks of the era, National City Bank. Under the guise of a duck hunting trip, these 6 powerful men spent 10 days drafting a plan to reform the U.S. banking system. Specifically, they designed a central bank, which the states didn't have at the time. So why all the secrecy? In the early 20th century, many Americans were terrified of the concept of a central bank, with fresh memories of monopolies and banker conspiracies. To call the new entity a central bank would have been to kill the idea on arrival. In the US at the time, that phrase was associated with monarchy and absolute control. So the Aldrich-Warburg plan was disguised as a harmless reform, and for this they came up with a different name, the National Reserve Association. It was designed to manage the money supply and support regional banks without being directly controlled by the government. However, Congress initially gave the idea a cold reception. The influence of major bankers was all too obvious. It was only after 1912, when the 28th President Woodrow Wilson came to power, that the project was revived and repackaged. Finally, on December 23, 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. On the eve of Christmas, America got something it had consciously rejected for nearly 80 years, a new central bank. The last time such an institution existed was under President Andrew Jackson, who fiercely fought against the central bank and shut it down in the 1830s, considering it a danger to democracy. Now, it had effectively returned under a new name, the Federal Reserve System. The Fed was initially conceived as a compromise, not fully governmental, but not entirely private either. 12 regional reserve banks were opened across the country, with a central board of governors in Washington, D.C. placed on top. This structure was meant to reassure the public, no financial monopoly, the money supply wouldn't be in one person's hands, but in a system with distributed responsibility. But in essence, the Fed became the powerful hydra the bankers had dreamed of on that island. It gained control over money creation, interest rates, and bank lending. In the same way, when you're starting out in any financial venture, it's crucial to choose reliable tools to manage your assets, just as the Fed uses its own set of tools to manage the economy. A few years ago, our team chose Bybit, and it's been our anchor in the highly volatile crypto market ever since. You can grab bonuses via the link in the description, or simply enter code 24676 when registering on the exchange. Don't miss your chance to step into one of the fastest growing markets. And now, let's move on. Interesting fact, the participants of the Jekyll Island meeting kept quiet about their hunting conference for over 20 years. The truth only surfaced in the 1930s. By then, the Fed was already firmly embedded in the US financial landscape. Created out of fear of crises, it had become the ultimate crisis fighter. But how exactly does the Fed manage to pull the strings of the entire global financial puppet? The Fed isn't just about the printing press. The Fed has a clear set of tools that turn it into the conductor of the economy. Its main goal is twofold: stable prices, low inflation, and maximum employment. And its primary instrument is the interest rate. Every 6 to 8 weeks, members of the Federal Open Market Committee meet to decide the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks lend money to each other for a very short term, usually overnight. If the economy is overheating and inflation is rising, the Fed raises the rate to cool down borrower enthusiasm. If there's a recession, it lowers the rate to stimulate credit and investment. But it's not enough to just announce a number. You have to make the markets follow it. How? Through open market operations. The Fed buys or sells government bonds, changing the amount of money in the banking system. For example, to lower the rate, the Fed enters the market and starts buying treasury bonds from banks. The banks get money in their accounts. Now there's more liquidity, the currency becomes cheaper, and the interbank rate falls. Magic, you say? No, just a well-thought-out system that's been working for years. Conversely, to raise the rate, the Fed sells bonds, taking money away from banks, making it harder for them to issue loans. Imagine a city where water is being given out for free. There's a lot of it, and it costs pennies. But if they start collecting the water back and stop the handouts, it becomes valuable, and the price goes up. It's the same with money. The less of it there is, the more expensive it becomes. After the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve began actively pumping money into the banking system by buying assets from banks. This money didn't immediately flow into the economy, it sat in special bank accounts at the Fed. These amounts are what's known as reserves in circulation. They are like excess money that banks keep at the Fed instead of lending out. A simple example: imagine you have a bag of money at home, but you don't spend it, you just keep it for a rainy day. That's your reserve. Banks do the same. They've accumulated large reserves on their accounts at the Fed, which are technically in the system but not actively working in the economy. The upper limit is the maximum rate at which banks can borrow from the Fed itself if they suddenly need cash and have no other options. This is the discount window, like a last resort for borrowing, but more expensive than usual. That's why banks try to avoid it and find money on the interbank market at a lower rate. The Fed also acts as the lender of last resort. If a bank is on the verge of collapse, the Federal Reserve can issue an emergency loan. For example, in the spring of 2023, Silicon Valley Bank, a major bank working with startups, went bankrupt. Due to rising interest rates, it lost money, panic ensued, and depositors rushed to withdraw their funds. The Fed intervened urgently. It promised to return all deposits and issued loans to other banks to stop the panic and prevent a chain reaction of collapses. It's like a fire hydrant. In normal times, it stands idle, but during a fire, it saves the day. But what if fires happen too often? Then the hydrant turns into a sprinkler system, and that's how a mechanism you definitely heard about in the news came to be: QE, or quantitative easing. This is when the Fed prints money and buys up bonds to inject more money into the economy. This term became famous after the 2008 crisis, when simply lowering rates no longer worked. They had already dropped to almost zero. So the Fed took an unprecedented step. It began to massively print money and buy up bonds, both government and mortgage-backed. Over several rounds of QE from 2008 to 2014, the Fed's balance sheet ballooned from less than $1 trillion to $4.5 trillion. That means the regulator bought trillions of dollars worth of assets. A huge amount of new money entered the economy, which helped avoid a deep recession but eventually fueled inflation. This was new money injected into the economy. Banks and investors received it, and in return, the Fed took their long-term bonds. The goal was to make credit cheaper for businesses and individuals, encouraging them to borrow and invest more, especially when traditional methods were no longer effective. How much this helped is a debatable question, but the fact is, the Fed bought so many government bonds that it essentially became the main financier of the US budget. For example, during the pandemic, it bought trillions of dollars in debt to cover social support and anti-crisis measures. And in 2020, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the printing press went into overdrive. The Fed once again slashed rates to zero and bought trillions of dollars in bonds to soften the shock of lockdowns. The Fed's balance sheet skyrocketed from $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion in record time. Money flooded the markets. The S&P 500 stock index hit all-time highs. The economy got a shot of adrenaline, along with the side effect of inflation, but more on that later. Liquidity from the Fed is the money it injects into banks so they have funds for loans and investments. Without this lifeblood, the system would simply grind to a halt. When there's plenty of it, markets rejoice. Credit is cheap, stocks rise, and the dollar flows around the world. As soon as the Fed turns off the spigot, that is, stops feeding money to the markets, banks and funds lose their cheap resources, and everything slows down. Investment, growth, even wages. This explains the sacred Wall Street mantra: don't fight the Fed. Whoever has the money has the power, and the Fed has as much money as it decides to print. For example, during the crises of 2008 and 2020, the Fed opened swap lines to 14 foreign central banks at once, lending them over $600 billion. While other regulators were saving their own banks, the Fed was reinforcing demand for the dollar. Without its swaps, global transactions would have simply stopped. The Fed was created to bring order to the American financial system, but over time its influence spread far beyond the borders of the United States. It was under the Fed's wing that the dollar began its ascent, from an ordinary currency to a global financial titan. How did this happen? How did the dollar become the planet's main currency, stockpiled by central banks and used to price oil and gold? Here, history, geopolitics, and lady luck all intertwine. Let's start with the fact that until the mid-20th century, the British pound still rivaled the dollar for influence. But World War II changed everything. Europe lay in ruins, Great Britain was financially drained, and the US, on the contrary, emerged as an economic victor with a powerful industrial base and 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. In 1944, the Allied nations gathered at Bretton Woods for a conference to reboot the global financial system. The result was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which effectively established the dollar as the new gold standard. 44 countries agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar, while the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. To manage the system, the IMF and the World Bank were created. Just like that, with the stroke of a pen and possessing the lion's share of the world's gold, the US appointed itself the global banker. An interesting fact, the head of the British delegation, John Maynard Keynes, proposed creating a separate international currency called the Bancor. But the US pushed for the dollar, leveraging the fact that they held almost 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. In the post-war years, the dollar became the foundation of international trade and reserves. Countries held dollars, knowing they could exchange them for gold at a fixed rate at any moment. The greenback was accepted everywhere, for oil, grain, machinery. This is how the term reserve currency emerged, a currency that central banks accumulate as a backup. And although the dollar's share has slightly declined, today it still accounts for about 59% of all global reserves. Nipping at its heels is the Chinese yuan, especially in trade with BRICS countries and in the East. However, maintaining the dollar-gold system proved to be not so simple. In the 1960s, the economies of many countries grew, while the US began to spend lavishly, especially on the Vietnam War and social programs, forcing it to print more money than it had gold to back it. The world began to suspect that the US lacked sufficient gold reserves to cover all the dollars held abroad. And they were right. In the summer of 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of dollars to gold, effectively closing the gold window. Bretton Woods collapsed. By 1973, currency rates were allowed to float freely and the dollar was no longer rigidly backed by gold. It seemed like a chance for other currencies to push the greenback aside. However, the opposite happened. The dollar strengthened its reign. Why? First, the US quickly made backroom deals to prop up demand for the dollar. A key moment was the 1974 agreement with Saudi Arabia, stipulating that the Saudis would sell oil exclusively for dollars. This gave rise to the term petrodollar. Countries importing oil were forced to hold dollar reserves to pay for it. They say oil is the lifeblood of the economy. The expression dates back to the oil crises of the 20th century, when it became clear that without oil, factories, transport, and even armies grind to a halt. Just like that, the dollar became the indispensable medium of exchange for commodities. Second, the American economy itself was the largest and relatively stable. The dollar was trusted. Despite abandoning the gold standard, inflation was brought under control. In the 1980s, the Fed, led by Paul Volcker, sharply raised rates, taming rampant prices. Furthermore, no other currency could offer a financial market as deep and liquid as the dollar's. US Treasury bonds became the world's primary savings asset. A huge market. Reliable, the US would never default, right? And these securities could be bought and sold at any moment. Even today, US government bonds represent one of the largest and most reliable markets in the world. These are the very securities that almost all countries, banks, and funds invest in because they consider them maximally safe. The dollar is backed by a huge and robust system, from US government debt to global payment networks. No other currency, not the yuan, not the euro, and certainly not crypto, has such support. As a result, by the end of the 20th century, the dollar had solidified its position as a universal equivalent. Moreover, central banks of all countries preferred to hold a hefty reserve of dollars. Not only are commodities traded in them, but it's also a convenient way to export inflation. This brings us to a concept the French called America's exorbitant privilege. The idea is that the world constantly needs dollars for trade and reserves, so the US can endlessly print them and borrow in its own currency. Other countries effectively lend to America by buying its bonds, and America pays them minimal interest because demand is high and yields are low. In the 1960s, French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing lamented that the dollar is their currency, but our problem. The US gets cheap financing for its deficits thanks to the dollar's status. Isn't that a privilege? However, everything has a price. The other side of the coin is that to supply the world with dollars, the US has run a trade deficit year after year, simply buying more from the world than it sells. Dollars flow abroad, goods flow into the States. Americans are happy, store shelves are overflowing with cheap imported junk, and life on credit continues. But for industry, it's not so great. A strong dollar hurts exports, factories close, and jobs move overseas. Economists call this the Triffin dilemma, named after Belgian professor Robert Triffin, who explained the contradiction in the 1960s. For the dollar to be the global currency, the US must constantly spend more than it earns and accumulate debt. But this undermines confidence in the dollar in the long run. A reserve currency inevitably leads to a conflict between domestic and foreign interests. For the global economy to have enough dollars, the US must spend and print more. Otherwise, global liquidity will suffocate. But the more they print, the larger the debt and the higher the risk of inflation at home. We'll examine this paradox right now, the mechanics of the US debt economy and its consequences. The American economy running on a debt-fueled steroid is a common saying among economists. And indeed, the states have built a unique financial model. Consumption and growth are sustained by constantly accumulating debt. Government, corporate, and household debt. What does this look like? Imagine a student who earns $10,000 but spends $15,000. Every month, he borrows money by issuing an IOU bond, a written promise to pay back. If he's reliable, people lend to him at a low interest rate. But as soon as there's a risk he won't pay back, creditors start demanding more. It's the same with countries. But the US is a special case because everyone buys American bonds, from Japan's pension fund to the Central Bank of China. Why? Because it's the universal reserve asset, reliable, liquid, and denominated in the world's reserve currency. As a result, the US government can accumulate debt without much trouble. By 2025, its size exceeded $30 trillion, and the markets have so far just shrugged. The world seems to be saying, issue as much as you need, we'll swallow it. It's a kind of debt feast, where the US is the guest of honor and the main diner, while the other guests pay for the cake. And the Fed plays the role of the pianist in this play, setting the tempo. When the US Treasury floods the markets with bonds, the Fed can step in and say, "Don't worry, we'll buy it all. There's enough liquidity." This happened in 2020 to 2021 when the budget deficit skyrocketed due to the COVID recession, and the Fed directly financed a significant portion of the new debt through QE. Simply put, the central bank printed money and gave it to the government by buying its bonds. This is called debt monetization. Of course, formally, the Fed is independent and doesn't answer to the Treasury Department. But when emergencies strike, the line blurs. As much is printed as needed to keep the economy from collapsing. Thus, a vicious cycle was born. Washington spends what it wants, the Fed ensures low interest rates, and the world provides demand for dollars. This system worked for decades. Since the 1980s, the US has almost constantly lived with a budget deficit and a trade deficit, covering the difference with new dollars and debt securities. Debt grew faster than the economy, but payments on it were small, thanks to low interest rates, largely provided by the Fed itself. When your central bank keeps rates near zero, servicing trillions in debt is easy. The interest is peanuts, a trap of its own making. But what are the consequences of such financial recklessness? First, a colossal debt. By 2025, the total US federal debt reached 120% of GDP, a level comparable to post-war highs. The private sector is also drowning in debt. Households owe on mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. Corporations issue bonds to buy back shares, and for other purposes. While rates were low, the US could borrow almost for free and invest that money in economic growth. But when the Fed raised rates in 2022 to 2023, payments on the already accumulated debt shot up. Imagine having a mortgage at 1% and then suddenly it's 6%. The payment skyrockets, hitting your budget hard. The same thing is happening at the national level. America risks spending more on interest payments than on defense or healthcare. This creates a trap. To tame inflation, the Fed raises rates, but in doing so, it corners the government and businesses into a debt trap. Second, persistent deficits and money printing distort the economy. The US has long been living beyond its means, importing more than it exports, spending more than it earns. Industrial areas, the so-called Rust Belt, have fallen into decline as manufacturing moved to countries with cheaper labor. What's left in the States are mainly banks, stock exchanges, and tech workers. The dollar remains strong, but that same exchange rate makes American goods too expensive abroad. Some economists, like Michael Pettis, believe that if the dollar were weaker, both the US and the world would be better off. Trade imbalances would disappear, and domestic production would revive. But it's hard to give up free credit. It's like living off rich relatives. Convenient, but the dependency grows. Third, the risk of financial bubbles. When money is available almost for free at low Fed rates, everyone chases profits. Investors take out loans and pour them into stocks. Real estate prices soar, and companies over-leverage themselves by buying back their own shares. This fuels stock market growth and a sense of wealth, but only for a time. Examples include the dot-com bubble of 2000 and the mortgage bubble of the 2000s. In all cases, one of the causes was excessively cheap liquidity. The Fed, of course, later tried to deflate the bubbles by raising rates, but it was too late. They burst loudly. In essence, the dollar system gives the US a superpower, but it also keeps kryptonite nearby. The superpower is print and borrow as much as the world demands of your currency. The counterforce is responsibility. If you go too far with debt and money printing, trust will fall. So far, the balance has been maintained, more or less. And now we'll find out who pays the bills for America's antics, who pays for the economic miracles, including inflation. The secret to the US economy's perpetual motion machine is simple. Spend more than you earn, and cover the difference with printed or borrowed dollars. It seems like a perfect scheme. The US got skyscrapers, the internet boom, and military adventures without worrying about its balance sheet. But miracles aren't free. Someone is footing the bill, sometimes invisibly, but very tangibly. Let's figure out who's covering the tab for this banquet. The first candidate is future American taxpayers. Every new trillion in debt is like a loan for an expensive party. A loud celebration today, but tomorrow you'll either have to tighten your belt or pay it back with interest. In other words, today's decisions are a bill that will be footed not by us, but by future generations. Politically, however, it's always easier to borrow today than to cut a program or raise a tax. So the debt has grown, is growing, and will continue to grow as long as there are buyers for the bonds. The second is dollar holders around the world, i.e. foreigners. When the Fed prints money and floods the market with liquidity, the dollar depreciates relative to real goods. This is inflation, a rise in prices, or in other words, a decline in the purchasing power of money. Inflation hits the pocket of everyone who holds savings in dollars. But while US citizens can still invest in stocks or real estate to outpace inflation, foreign dollar holders often simply lose out. A simple example, a central bank of some country has accumulated $100 billion in reserves, invested in US bonds at 1 to 2% annual interest. The Fed turns on the printing press. The dollar supply increases, and over the year, inflation in the US is, say, 8%. In real terms, those reserves have depreciated by that same 8% minus a tiny bit of interest income. Imagine this. You put $100,000 in a deposit account earning 2% a year to save it. Meanwhile, prices in the country rise by 8%. In the end, despite the interest, you can now buy less with that money than you could a year ago. Your savings have effectively shrunk. as if a part of their value was secretly siphoned off. Foreigners have effectively given an interest-free loan to the US and paid a hidden tax through the depreciation of the dollar. It's not for nothing that inflation is called a hidden tax. It invisibly takes a portion of wealth from everyone who holds money. The US government wins, old debts can be repaid with devalued dollars. Isn't that a sleight of hand? To make it clearer, here's an example. Since the Fed's founding in 1913, the dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. If we found a time capsule with $100 from 1913 untouched, today it would be the equivalent of less than $4. That's the scale of long-term inflation. Of course, over more than a century, the economy has grown many times over. Wages have increased. The average person doesn't feel this directly. But the fact screams. Constant, low-level inflation, year after year, is the government's method of burning off debt and its costs at the expense of the population. The third payer is ordinary Americans, especially the poor and the middle class. Inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. Those with assets, a house, stocks, a business, often even benefit. Asset prices rise along with inflation. But for those living paycheck to paycheck, it's the worst. Prices for gas, food, and rent go up while wages can't keep pace. In 2022, the US faced its highest inflation in 40 years, approximately 9% annually, and people felt how everything, from milk to housing, was getting more expensive. The Fed was forced to sharply raise rates to cool prices, but this always risks a rise in unemployment. It turns into a kind of tax on the poor. Those who are less financially protected pay for monetary experiments with a lower standard of living. The fourth is emerging markets. There's an interesting effect in the global economy. When the Fed prints a lot of money and keeps rates low, capital seeks higher returns abroad. Money flows into Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, causing credit booms, strengthening local currencies, and making imports cheaper. But as soon as the Fed changes course, raises rates, and reduces liquidity, the dollar comes rushing back home, and emerging markets suffer a hangover. Currencies devalue, debts, often denominated in dollars, become more expensive, and crises erupt. This has happened more than once. The debt crisis in Latin America in the 1980s, the Asian crisis of 1997. In both cases, a sharp reversal of US monetary policy was one of the causes. You could say that other countries pay for part of the turbulence, as their financial stability becomes a hostage to the Fed's decisions. Finally, how can we not mention the environment and the global economy as a whole? The constant race for GDP growth, fueled by easy money, leads to overconsumption of the planet's resources and then to global imbalances, but that's a more philosophical view. Nevertheless, the world economy has become significantly more indebted. Total debt, public plus private, has exceeded 350% of global GDP, and the US is the core of this system. Every time a growth miracle is achieved through new debt injections, risk accumulates in the system for all participants. The conclusion? America's economic miracles are paid for collectively, by future US taxpayers and by everyone who uses dollars and trusts them with their savings. Inflation acts as a dividing line. It redistributes wealth from those who have money to those who have debt. And the world's largest debtor, the US government, is happy with this exchange. Next, we'll see that this status quo could be disrupted, as too many are starting to ask, is it worth continuing to sponsor this paper sovereign? So the dollar still reigns supreme in the world of finance, sitting on a throne built of trust and tradition. But no empire lasts forever. In the 21st century, challenges are emerging that could shake the dollar's dominance. Let's list the contenders for the throne and the threats. Central bank digital currencies. Almost all major economies are now developing their own digital money. The idea is to create a digital version of a national currency that circulates directly through the central bank, bypassing commercial banks. Why? First, to keep up with technology. Cash is becoming a thing of the past. Second, to improve control over transactions and payments. But there's also a geopolitical aspect. Digital currencies could potentially allow countries to trade directly without the US dollar as an intermediary. China is leading the way. Its digital yuan has already been tested by hundreds of millions of citizens, with billions of yuan in transactions in pilot programs. A digital rupee, India, and a digital real, Brazil, are on the way, and Europe is developing a digital euro, expected to launch around 2028. The US is taking its time with a digital dollar. The responsibility of being the world's reserve currency is too great, and commercial banks are lobbying against it. They're not thrilled about losing a piece of their business. However, the trend is clear. Over 130 countries, representing 98% of global GDP, are exploring or implementing CBDCs. How does this threaten the dollar? Imagine if countries agree to connect their digital currencies through new payment systems, the need to hold dollars for international settlements will decrease. Sanctions will become easier to bypass. No need for SWIFT or American banks. Payments could go directly between, say, a digital yuan and a digital rupee. It's no coincidence that after sanctions were imposed on Russia, interest in CBDCs surged, including among US allies. Europe began to think about payment autonomy and its own payment system to avoid dependency on Visa or MasterCard in the US. If these projects succeed, the global currency network will become multipolar, and the dollar as a universal payment layer will lose some of its influence. Now for de-dollarization. This trendy, formidable term describes the collective efforts of various countries to reduce their dependence on the dollar in trade and reserves. This idea is being pushed particularly hard by countries unfriendly to the US or under sanctions. Russia and China have been actively shifting their bilateral trade to rubles and yuan in recent years. The dollar's share in their trade has fallen from approximately 90% to 50% or less. National currencies or the euro are used instead. China is striking deals with Brazil without dollars. And India is buying oil from Russia with rupees. And the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have even started talking about creating a common currency or payment unit. Although experts are skeptical, the economies are very different and there's no common central bank, the message itself is important. The dollar's share of global reserves is declining. 20 years ago, it was approximately 70%. Now it's around 58 to 59%. The euro has taken some of that share, approximately 20%, and the Chinese yuan has grown slightly, still only approximately 3 to 4% of reserves, but the trend is upward. Saudi Arabia has hinted that it's open to accepting payment for oil in other currencies. In many capitals, people are starting to wonder, are we relying too much on the dollar? After all, if a country's relationship with Washington sours tomorrow, its dollar reserves could be frozen. In 2022, the US blocked $300 billion of Russian assets. The weaponization of the dollar has made even allies nervous. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen admitted that the aggressive use of sanctions undermines trust in the dollar. The bottom line, the world isn't abandoning the dollar en masse just yet, but more and more countries are gradually chipping away at its dominance in the global economy. The U.S., of course, is doing everything it can to maintain its influence, actively urging governments in Africa and Asia not to abandon the dollar. But the process has begun. A complete rejection of the dollar won't happen. It's too deeply integrated, but its role is already diminishing. And now for the wild card. Yes, cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin and hundreds of other cryptocurrencies were originally conceived as an alternative to state-controlled money. Their main idea is decentralization. No single issuer, all transactions are confirmed on a network, and a limited supply, a hard cap on issuance. For example, Bitcoin has a maximum of 21 million coins and not one more. Theoretically, independent cryptocurrencies could replace reserve assets. For example, proponents have called Bitcoin digital gold. A country could hold part of its reserves in BTC and not fear them being frozen or devalued by money printing. There have even been precedents. El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender alongside the dollar in 2021. However, reality has cooled the enthusiasm. Crypto's volatility is extreme. Bitcoin can drop 50% in a couple of months. What kind of reliable reserve is that? There's no infrastructure for global trade on crypto, and governments themselves are not ready to give up control over their monetary systems. Many call cryptocurrencies the digital Wild West, great for shady dealers, questionable for macroeconomics. Instead of replacing the dollar, Bitcoin has become more of a speculative asset, like digital gold, a long-term hedge against inflation for some investors, but not a medium of exchange on a large scale, at least not yet. Major economies from India to China have partially restricted cryptocurrency circulation. US regulators have also started to tame the industry. At the same time, the idea that crypto brought, blockchain, has proven to be in demand. The irony is that central banks are adapting blockchain technology for their own digital currencies to compete with private crypto. Thus, the threat of cryptocurrencies to the dollar is currently conceptual. It has shown the world that money outside the state system is possible. If trust in all fiat currencies, including the dollar, were to be undermined, who knows? Maybe people would flock to independent digital assets. But for now, the dollar has little to fear here. Its main competitor is not Bitcoin, but other state currencies, the euro and the yuan. And what about gold? The good old metal that has served as a measure of value for thousands of years. Today, gold is back in favor. The world's central banks are buying it at a record pace. In 2022, they purchased 1,136 tons, more than at any time since 1950. And the leaders are not Western, but emerging economies: Turkey, China, India, Russia, and others. This trend is no accident. Gold is attractive because it is not dependent on any single government. You can't print it, sanction it, or freeze accounts holding it. For central banks, gold is a way to diversify reserves and reduce their share of dollars and euros. After 2008, Western bankers stopped selling off their gold reserves. It used to be thought that holding gold was unprofitable compared to income-generating assets, while many developing countries began to accumulate the metal. This process accelerated after the 2022 sanctions. The freezing of Russian reserves proved that trusting paper assets in a foreign jurisdiction is risky, and gold is a safe haven in case of financial attacks. Of course, it won't become the new global currency. It has a different role. But if the share of precious metals in reserves is growing, it means the share of currencies, including the dollar, is declining. Already, the world's central banks hold about 35,000 tons of gold. Some economists propose using gold and a basket of currencies as the basis for a new settlement unit, one that is more stable and independent of the dollar. For now, this is just an idea, but the very desire to bring something tangible back into the system speaks to a lack of trust in the current order. And if such sentiments are growing, it means confidence in the dollar is not what it used to be. Thus, the dollar's throne is shaking not because of a single rival, but from a multitude of erosions. Digital currencies, alternative trading blocks, regional payment systems, crypto assets, and the return of gold are all gradually chipping away at the greenback's monopoly. But let's be realistic. None of these challenges can dethrone the paper king overnight. The euro is still divided by the national interests of EU countries. The yuan is not fully convertible, and China itself is cautious. Crypto is unstable, and gold is cumbersome for daily trade. The dollar prevails due to inertia and the lack of an equivalent replacement. However, it's already becoming more difficult for Washington to use sanctions without consequences. Countries are starting to find workarounds. For example, India buys oil from Iran with rupees, bypassing the dollar. As one expert publication aptly put it, the overuse of the dollar weapon is like overprescribing antibiotics. Sooner or later, alternative systems will emerge that don't need the dollar. Finale, practical takeaways for the viewer. So we've learned that the Federal Reserve is not a shadowy, behind-the-scenes manipulator, but a real financial hydra that grew out of historical necessity. It manages the most powerful currency, sets the price of money for the entire world, and can do things other central banks can only dream of. Behind the Fed is the might of the US economy, global demand for the dollar, and decades of trust. Its tools, the interest rate, liquidity, the printing press, have become defining factors for global markets. As long as people, companies, and governments around the world play by the dollar's rules, the conductor in Washington calls the tune. To keep its crown, the US will have to be more careful with the trust of its partners, not to inflate its debt indefinitely, not to overuse the sanctions club, and to work on innovation, including perhaps its own digital dollar to compete with foreign CBDCs. Otherwise, the world will find ways to diversify more quickly. The conclusion is simple. Understand the system you live in. Even if you're far from macroeconomics, the Fed's decisions affect your wallet. Through your national currency's exchange rate, through the prices of goods, through interest rates on loans. Don't fight the Fed is a good rule for traders and ordinary people alike. For example, during periods when the Fed is fueling inflation by printing money, holding everything in cash dollars is a bad idea. It's better to invest in something more reliable. And when the Fed sharply raises rates, be cautious with borrowed money. Loans will get more expensive. The world is changing, and in 10 to 15 years, your savings portfolio will look different. It used to be enough to save in dollars. Now it's wise to look at gold. Central banks aren't buying it for nothing. Keep an eye on the development of digital currencies and pay attention to the stability of your own national economy to know how it will weather a potential storm if the dollar weakens. In any case, knowledge is power. We've tried to explain complex things in simple language. And now, let's sum up. The Fed is not an all-powerful god, but it's not a harmless banker either. It's a complex mechanism that keeps the world economy on its toes. By understanding its structure and power, you'll look at the news differently. A rate decision is not just a boring number, but a signal to act. For some, to tighten their belts, and for others, to seize an opportunity. The dollar will someday be pushed aside by another currency, but for now, it still reigns. That means, whether we like it or not, we have to be its subjects. And a wise subject always keeps their ear to the ground about the future. Well, if you found this video useful, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and be sure to check out the links in the description. Subscribe to the channel because there's a lot of interesting content ahead. See you next time.